Hey everyone, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app. Today I'm joined by Bob Schut, and we will be concluding our discussion of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. I believe this is our 13th installment, Bob.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I think it might be. So I think we're going to cover the last 2/3 of chapter 5 today. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let me pull my notes up here. I've been tasked with sort of taking control of section 2, and the section is called the problem of the disciple at second hand. And I thought this was a pretty lucid account of Kierkegaard's here. It made a lot of sense to me, built on a lot of what Bob has laid out in previous episodes. I do have one really penetrating discussion question that could take up a lot of time, and then Bob's going to take us out from the asterisk to the conclusion. So Kierkegaard says that we have two considerations that we must tangle with before we pick up the problem of the disciple at second hand. And it really seems like he splits them into 3 enumerated ones that are all sort of interconnected. And the first one, and I'll just quote him directly, says, "If our fact is assumed to be a simple historical fact, contemporaneity is a desideratum." I'm sure I mispronounced the Latin there, desideratum. I should probably just say here real quick that desideratum means something that is desirable. And from what we've talked about earlier on the philosophical fragments, contemporaneity means that you are sort of immediately a contemporary with the historical fact that we're considering. And we're not just considering any historical fact. We're considering the incarnation of the God in flesh. So is to be immediately contemporaneous with the divine, to be able to reach out and touch Jesus Christ. Now, the problem with our situation is that for a simple historical fact, it obviously is a desirable situation to be closer to that event, to verify its truth and its veracity. But our historical fact is not a historical fact. Historical facts are typically are relative, and they're just kind of one thing after another, and it would be absolutely insane to go about absolutizing it. But we take our particular historical fact, the incarnation, and turn it into something that our entire lives revolve around. Other historical facts that we don't do that to, like Napoleon getting defeated at Waterloo, or man landing on the moon, or something like that. We don't tend to build our lives around these events existentially. But the God coming into the world, this is not just any historical fact, which leads to the second consideration. And I'll quote B, "If the fact in question is an eternal fact, every age is equally near." Now, Kierkegaard's Johann Climacus warns us that we have to be careful about the usage of the word fact. That's something kind of derived from our banting about of different historical terminology and stuff like that. It's kind of used inexactly, but what I think what he's trying to get here, and it feeds into the next quotation as well, is that no one can be closer to this particular event that our lives are built around existentially. If something is eternal, we're all sort of going to be in the same sort of relation to it. And that leads into this next quotation. "If the fact in question is an absolute fact, or to determine it still more precisely, if it is the fact we have described, it would be a contradiction to suppose that time had any power to differentiate the fortunes of men with respect to it. And if it could be differentiated by time, then our fact is not really absolute. Our absolute would be relative to other things, and this is an impossibility. But we can't forget that our absolute is, also a historical fact, and it's precisely that the absolute being a historical fact makes it an object of faith. And we may ask ourselves why. And we might say, is it because it must be willed to be believed and cannot be known objectively? And I think that might be the case. The historical aspect of the absolute fact is emphasized to force an absolute decision on the contradiction. And if we were to eliminate the historical aspect of a fact, and we wouldn't want to do that, then the fact would be just eternal. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what would be wrong with that? And it seems to be the case, and I'll let Bob chime in here, it seems to be the case that the historical gives the occasion for the contemporary to become the disciple. And this allows for successive generations to be disciples. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that when an eternal absolutized fact has historical dimension to it, it presents us with a contradiction and an occasion to set aside our reason and let the God give us the condition to acknowledge our sin and to meet God existentially halfway. That's what I understand about why it's important to emphasize the historical dimension to it. Otherwise, we don't get that paradox that allows us to perhaps know God on a different level than objective cognition. And, you know, if we didn't have that historical dimension, everything would return to the Socratic, and we could not really have faith occur, right? We'd be left with the alternate description of things that we've talked about so much throughout the philosophical fragments. The historical gives us that occasion for becoming a disciple. But like I said earlier, it's the God that gives us the condition. Okay, so I sped through a lot of things there, but what do you think about my summarization? Is it errant? Is it, do you object to anything I've said? Do you think anything needs to be clarified? I kind of went quick. What do you think?
I think pretty cogent, easy to understand. We can revisit the idea of only to clarify, not to correct, but just to clarify the difference between eternity and between time. I know we kind of discussed that a little bit offline yesterday, I think it was. And it depends upon the context. A lot of times we see the word eternity and we think of it as elongated time. It's time without end, without beginning, and we kind of still try to put that in the box of time. But I think the way Kierkegaard is speaking about eternity, it's not really a redefinition of time elongated, but rather a state of being where there is no time, which completely changes the way we look at. So when we have God coming from no time into time, we see the paradox a little clearer. We see that there's a gap, there's a wall. How does God go from no time into time, rather than some kind of a parallel universe that God is jumping from one parallel side end of the parallel into another? It's more of such a such a change of state that it is just unknowable. And I think that's what he's trying to emphasize here, is that idea that God is coming from no time into our time, and the ramifications of that event. And why does he even want to do something like that? And as you said before, he comes in to give us the occasion, which I like to call it the opportunity, to see him, to understand him, and I like to use the word to perceive him. We can think about God, and we can write books about God and have all this intellectual resource about who God is and what God is. But that's different from actually perceiving God and from a physical, relational perception of God. And that only happens because we have the condition. God presents us with that condition. And so the reason he comes into our time is, just like you said, to present us with that opportunity for the condition. And what is the condition? When it really boils down to it, he is the condition. He becomes the condition. That's why it's so important that the God or the teacher, and we have to remember, as I'll explain it as we get to it, we have to remember who Kierkegaard isn't yet giving it away, who we're talking about. He's calling him the teacher. And so it's this teacher himself who becomes the condition. Okay, and that's, as he'll explain later again, is what differentiates Christianity from all other religions. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, so let me pass it back to you to.
Yeah, well, I think you raised a number of really interesting questions, and if anyone is intrigued, I think Bob and I will continue this conversation about no time, timelessness, eternity, parallel universes, and whatnot. Later in the week, we'll be taking up a discussion of Sartre's being, or not being in nothingness. We'll be taking up a discussion of Sartre's no exit, where some of these ideas are pursued at greater length, and I'm sure we'll bring a lot of our Kierkegaard influence in that. So if you're interested, be sure to check that out. So Kierkegaard says, okay, now we've got these pre-considerations, or these considerations taken care of. Now we can begin to tackle this problem of the disciple at secondhand. We're like Bob has said, we are made disciples by God giving us the condition. And I may want to ask, I guess, Bob, the only thing that I would ask for clarification on there is that is the teacher, and we've talked about this at length elsewhere, but just for a refresher, I typically think of the teacher as someone who gives the condition, someone that allows us to see our sin consciousness, but that the teacher is not, his identity is not so much in the condition, that preparatory condition, but the teacher itself is truth. Okay. Do you think I'm splitting hairs too much there? Or do you think it's more proper to say that the teacher is condition and truth?
Well, I think the words are important, and I think some of the things I've said might be misleading. So let me clarify. When I say that the teacher is the condition, what I mean is he is inseparable from the condition.
Yes.
The condition comes about because of the teacher being the teacher. So it's kind of like smoke from fire, I think is a word for that, the epiphanal. Mm-hmm. It's a product of the teacher, and it cannot be had without the teacher. So the two are so distinct. The two are so attached to one another that they're really inseparable. You can't have one without the other.
I think that's a great way to explain it, the smoke and fire analogy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. So jumping back into it, so what becomes of the problem of the secondhand disciple? If everyone is receiving the condition from God directly, is there such a thing as a secondhand disciple? Aren't we all contemporaries? And Johann Climacus, or Kierkegaard, asks us to, let's just, play pretend. Let's assume that it is otherwise, that the contemporaries got the condition from God and pass it down to subsequent generations. Well, what would follow? The subsequent disciples would come to believe in the contemporary disciples. The contemporary disciples would become objects of faith. The contemporaries would be gods. And that's totally absurd. We wouldn't marshal that before a general public, let alone the standard bearer of reason for Kierkegaard, Socrates, that somehow, that someone is a god because of the relation to the god, or that a human being is a god in relation to a human being. Socrates, understood that we were just midwives for one another. Now, if we could pass the condition down like this, I guess we could help bring back a dimension of the Socratic where we're helping each other find the truth or something like that. But Socrates wouldn't have it that we would be elevated above anything but a midwife. We wouldn't be these gods that are kind of just like giving people condition and the truth like the cold or something like that. And for these reasons, there can never be a disciple at secondhand. And for many other reasons too. So how can a contemporary help his successor? And I guess we can ask ourselves as successors how we can help those who will succeed us. And Kierkegaard gives us two routes. He says, A, that we can inform everybody that what we believe is in fact based upon a contradiction, that the God came into time. the finite and the infinite are one, that the historical and the eternal are part of this absolutized thing that we believe. And when we do that, what we're communicating to the audience that's listening to this, or anyone that'll hear us, that I cannot brainwash you. I cannot bully you into believing what I believe. What I believe is something that I have radically chosen in my own freedom, as the Sartre bleeds into my discussion of Kierkegaard. And if you want to know anything about what I'm talking about, that's the only way that you're going to get it. You have got to make up your own mind for this thing as well. There's no way that I can indoctrinate you with it. And do you want to say something about that, Bob?
But I was going to kind of just slow you down right there, because Kierkegaard doesn't bring this up, and I just want to clarify that we're talking about a true relationship with God here. But it is also true, and I wanted to discuss this with you.
Sure, please.
That there are millions of people all over the world who do believe in the, or who are brainwashed, let's say, in this discussion, we'll use that term, who are convinced that this person is a god. They are convinced that this person is a leader of sorts. And so I think we need to address that. There's certainly an opportunity for people to give up their freedom to another, because it's a lot easier to just kind of dump on this one person and say, well, I don't know a lot about God and I don't want all that responsibility, so I'm going to let you do all that for me. So here's my freedom. I'm a coward, as Sartre would say. I'm a coward. I'm going to give you my freedom so I don't have to have that responsibility. Whether he's a priest, whether he's a minister, whether he's an association, whether it's an angel, it doesn't matter. This is so important, this area here that you're talking about, that we preserve that idea that in a true relationship with God, you can't have another man as your intermediary.
Right.
Because it would translate, if each generation passed this along, you wouldn't wind up with one God. You'd wind up with a pantheon of gods. Each generation would create their own God. And so you'd have many, many gods, which Kierkegaard considers this to be a contradiction, a conflict, what he's been trying to say all along, that you have to have only the one God. And only this one God is the one who comes into time. And only this one God is the one who brings out this condition. So if this were true, that you had a secondary successor here, it would completely annihilate, I guess is a word, what he's trying to say here about the uniqueness about the teacher in our particular context. Would you agree with that about the?
Yeah, and I think I'm going fast because I get caught up in sort of the performance of what we do here, but I think it is important to slow down a little bit and ask some questions. I think this issue for Kierkegaard is what put him at odds with so much of what was going on within European Christendom at the time, and why he struggled with the church. Because I think he felt like there was sort of there were things about there were things that were creating separation between individuals and God and people being elevated and whatnot. I guess I'm curious in your opinion, mm-hmm. what this means for us as Protestants, how we are to view the role of the sermonizer. I mean, I live close to a Quaker community over here, and they're just moved by the Holy Spirit to sort of speak whatever it's called the circle of friends. Mm-hmm. And I know the reason why I'm asking these questions, because I know you've thought deeply about them over your life. You've studied a lot of world religions, and I think it would be important to hear. I mean, is there something really right about the way that Quakers have it, instead of having sort of this spiritual leader who pontificates every Sunday? And then further, I know that there's a lot of Catholic interest in Kierkegaard, and I want us to be very, very, I don't want us to say anything that could be viewed as anti-Catholic here, but I wonder if what Kierkegaard's points on these matters make it very difficult to be both a Kierkegaard, to both follow Kierkegaard in his existential philosophy and to be a Catholic, because at least, and I'm just saying this from the outside as someone who's only known Protestantism, it seems like there are all sorts of intermediaries within the Catholic tradition that may prevent that sort of direct relationship. There's prayers to saints and obviously the papacy and stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't want to sound ignorant in asking that question, but I am interested in the reverberations of that mindset for our Protestant churches and for within the Catholic churches. And Bob, I've kind of handed you a grenade. I don't, but you're so knowledgeable about these things. I feel like you could address it in the spirit of inclusiveness and open-mindedness for it to be a worthwhile digression.
I'm going to jump on top of the grenade and comment this way. I was born Roman Catholic. I worshiped Roman Catholic for 18 years or so forth. I've also actually worshipped with the Quakers. I've been in the circle of friends. I have a real variety. My lifetime is just all over the place. Okay.
So I guess I asked a perfect question without knowing it.
And my experience has been, it doesn't matter if you're a Roman Catholic or a Protestant or a Quaker, you can be deceived and you can face the same temptations in each one to find something else as an intermediary. It's all around us, and it faces us as individuals. Yes, there's a lot of opportunities in the Roman Catholic Church to be distracted, and that's how I like to think of it. There's a lot of distractions, things that take you away from the purity of faith. I don't think they really want it that way. They see it as a way to kind of help the people who haven't yet achieved that perfect faith. So they see it as hopefully a ladder structure to get higher and higher. We might see it as distractions, but those distractions are in the Protestant church too. How many churches have taken the Bible and instead of building faith upon what's written in the Bible becomes the object of faith.
Right.
And their interpretations become the word of God rather than what actually is in the Bible. So it's easy to become a Pharisee. If I try to relate the two, it's easy to become Pharisaical and not know it. So it's so easy to get caught up in this. And just because, Protestants don't wear a whole lot of garb, although some of them do. Right now I go to a Lutheran church and they wear robes and they wear stuff like that. So, criticism could be said of that. But the distractions are wherever you are and whatever faith you're in. I've been in almost every denomination you can mention, and I see the opportunity for distraction. And I think that's what attracts me to Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard undercuts all that, and he gets back to the purity of what faith was supposed to be, and he's going to offend every denomination. To be honest with you, if you really understand Kierkegaard, he's going to offend everybody, pretty much.
Well, what about, since you did spend time with the Quaker Church, I mean, can you say anything about whether or not those distractions exist in the circle of friends, or? Yeah,
the distraction is intellectualism. They tend to intellectualize God. At the same time they spiritualize him. He tends to, the group tends to attract intellectuals, but they become more involved. They become very much involved in social causes and so forth. But there's an intellectual undercurrent that takes place in there that can distract you. I'm not saying that, if you're going to be distracted, but I'm saying that's the difficulty that you have to watch out for, that you don't become isolated also in your own little community well, we're the only ones who have it right, and everybody else has it wrong. So it's easy to get caught up in that. We've got the Mennonites and you got the Amish, who kind of separate themselves. But there's two different versions of Quakers. You have the circle of friends who meet in the meeting place, a little house, a house, or any place really, and kind of the old-fashioned. And then you have the evangelical Quakers, who you wouldn't know the difference between that and a Presbyterian service, pretty much, or Baptist service is probably closer to it. So there is a wide range between Protestants and between Catholics and so forth. So,
I always, the most famous Quaker that comes to mind is Richard Nixon. And I always sort of imagined what it'd be like to be in the circle of friends with Richard Nixon. I imagine that would be pretty surreal. Yeah. Maybe he was more of the evangelical variety. I don't know much about that. So yeah, that was incredibly illuminating. I thought very thoughtfully handled there, Bob. And thanks for jumping on the grenade.
Thank you.
So the other thing that Kierkegaard tells us about how we can help the successor is that, we can relate this content of this fact, this what is occurring within us, but it exists really only for faith. Like colors, like I can tell you about like the color red, but it really, the only way you're going to know about the color red is that if you have the sense organs to discern red, and you need to be able to cultivate the sense for faith to really understand any sort of testimony for it. And then Kierkegaard says, in what sense may the credibility of a contemporary witness interest a successor? If this disciple at secondhand doesn't really exist, why do we even care about that contemporary witness? The witness's credibility might have significance for a simple historical fact. If a crime was committed, we would want that witness to be of high upstanding moral character so we could judge their testimony to be reliable, or if we needed someone to tell us about Napoleon, that this was a lucid person that could not dream up fantasies and tell us the truth. But this particular historical fact, our historical fact, that of the divine teacher, is an object for faith, and it cannot be directly communicated. If it were a simple historical fact, then the source would matter more. But this is going to bring up some stuff that Bob and I have talked about in previous episodes about the perceived or real or unreal incongruities of the New Testament. Kierkegaard says, because our fact is not a simple historical fact, the greatest detail does not really make a difference. It really all we really need is kind of this idea that God became man and that inconsistencies don't really matter. He says, to quote him from Philosophical Fragments, if the contemporary generation had left nothing behind them but these words, we have believed that in such and such a year that God appeared among us in the humble figure of a servant, that he lived and taught in our community and finally died, it would be more than enough. And I have written here, because I thought this was incredibly interesting, and I want to ask Robert about this. Kierkegaard does not emphasize the resurrection at all and what's absolutely essential for the contemporaries to pass on to successors. So much so that it made me ask, and I want to get Bob's take on this, is the resurrection an insignificant detail for Kierkegaard? Because to me, the resurrection is not an essential. It seems like the resurrection would be necessary to testify to the God-man status. What say you, Bob?
Oh, when I read this, that question came to my own mind, and I thought, why is he stopping there? Why doesn't he just take it to the last? But and I really didn't get it until earlier today, to be honest with you, as I was driving to the coffee shop thinking about that question, and then it dawned upon me. This isn't Kierkegaard. We have to remember this is Climacus. Okay, and Climacus's point is he's speaking about the God and the teacher. and the focus is upon God becoming man. And although he does give other hints that we all kind of know who the teacher is, we can't jump to that conclusion because he's not doing that. The work has to remain with this indirectness so that he can make this point without actually saying, okay, we're here talking about Jesus now, because then it would become a direct communication, which is not the way he wants to write this. He wants to write this from kind of from one step removed so he can make his point without directly assaulting the reader. Otherwise, if the reader kind of knows who it is, he might step back and say, well, I don't want to read this about Christ. You know, this is religious stuff. But the way he's doing it so indirectly about the God and the teacher, we have to keep that in mind. And I know you and we both get lost in it because we know it's Kierkegaard. But we just, for here, we have to recognize that he stops there for a reason, because it's actually Climacus, not Kierkegaard.
Well, I would buy that as a satisfactory answer. And I think it's a great answer. But what makes me still a little uncertain about your answer is that this is not the first time I've thought this thought. And I actually believe that there is a paper out there that someone else has like devoted serious scholarly work to it. I've read it before, and I can't remember what the conclusion is. I think if memory serves me correctly, I think it tries to make the case that the resurrection didn't really matter that much for Kierkegaard. But I don't quote me on that because it's been a while since I've looked at the paper. I think the only reason why I'm so uncertain about your answer is that I struggle to think of other Kierkegaard books, direct signings, where the resurrection is really given a lot of attention. Now, I could be just sleep deprived and my brain isn't thinking like it should, but I mean, is there another book in Kierkegaard's corpus or authorship, the direct signings, where he's talked at length about the resurrection?
I don't remember if there is. I believe that he talks about it indirectly, but I would have to do a word search, on some of his writings to see if the actual word resurrection appears. I would say I think he does someplace talk about it. I would not.
It's a little weird that we're struggling to find. It's a little weird that we're struggling, right?
Yeah, but I would disagree with that writer that we can assume that the resurrection in Kierkegaard's mind doesn't mean anything, because everything he's writing in this book shows that this historical appearance of God is so important that this teacher becomes the condition. And I think later on, after the asterisk, I'm going to bring it up a little bit where I think he's talking about it indirectly. But I think it is fascinating why he doesn't really address it unless this is more of a continuation of that indirect method. But that's a good question. I think we can deal with that in some of the other works when we read about Kierkegaard. But I'll try to do a little more research on that.
I'm not saying that Kierkegaard doesn't, but I want to clarify this. I'm not trying to say that Kierkegaard doesn't believe that the resurrection happened.
Okay.
What I'm concerned, and I don't think you are thinking that I'm saying that either. What I'm trying to say here is that it may be a detail on the same level as like who saw Jesus resurrected first, right? Mm-hmm. Like, or did Jesus appear to this many people or this many people? Did he assume this form or that form? Like, yeah. It's just not. It doesn't raise the same status as God entering time.
Right. Exactly.
And so I'm not saying that Kierkegaard denied the resurrection. It seems to be. I mean, he says like all that we needed was that like, oh yeah, the God came and the God died, but it's just so weird that it's omitted. And maybe it's the authorial intention.
Yeah, I think that in this particular work, Luke, I think that the idea that we have to see this through Callimachus's eyes. Yeah. I think that's the answer for this particular document. But what you're raising, that question, is really interesting to see if he avoids the resurrection, talk of the resurrection, and then we'd have to say why. Because otherwise, I don't want to give it away, but what would the purpose be of God coming and giving man this opportunity if he doesn't follow through with this act? So we'll see what happens as we go.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just finish it up here. So the successor believes the testimony of the contemporary, but that's always going to be ambiguous and uncertain. And we've talked about how this gives the occasion to receive the condition from God. And there really is no disciple at second hand. Everyone receives faith essentially in the same way, and we're all in equal relation to God. The contemporary generation just has immediate contemporaneity with Christ, and later generations have the testimony, but both merely serve as the occasion for faith. So that's what I had for today. And I'll hand it all over to Bob now.
Okay, get to the asterisks here. So now he has a dialogue. And he's done this before also. He kind of creates this imaginary critic who's going to criticize his works and talk about things that he said. And so this imaginary critic brings up that Callimachus, you're not that original. He said, these aren't your own thoughts here. I've read this stuff before. As a matter of fact, I've read a lot of this stuff already in the Gospel of John. So, don't think you're being original here. But he says, I agree with you that I agree with you on the subject of the second-hand disciple. No, there is no second-hand. There is just the disciple, and each one of us is confronted with the paradox at the same level. There's no advantage of being a first-hand or a second-hand. When he says the advantage would be dubious, meaning very doubtful. And he agrees that the immediate contemporary is by no means an advantage. So this critic is agreeing with everything that Callimachus has said here. And he says that the danger of being an immediate contemporary is that you get caught up in the senses of seeing and hearing. So I'll read this little phrase here. It was on page 133 of my copy. It says, the immediate contemporaneity is so far from being an advantage that the contemporary must precisely desire its cessation, lest he be tempted to devote himself to seeing and hearing with his bodily eyes and ears, which is all a waste of effort and a grievous, a dangerous toil. So, what is he referring to here? He's referring to the idea that not only could it be a dubious advantage for the contemporary, but he could get caught up in the physical or the historical moment of the teacher and miss what the teacher's trying to actually teach and be. And I think he relates this to Peter. I think this is a good example, again, of Peter not willing to release Jesus from the world when Jesus talks about near the end of the gospel, and Jesus talks about he's going to leave. Peter, grabs him and says, no, Jesus, you can't leave. What are we going to do without you if you leave us? And Jesus' famous answer, of course, is, get thee behind me, Satan. Because your mind isn't on the things of God, but on the things of the world. So Peter was missing that spiritual aspect of the presence of Jesus and what Jesus actually came to do and to become. So he got lost in the his situation between the Romans and the Jews. And he's thinking, well, when are you going to destroy all the Romans, Jesus? You can't leave us here now. You started this big thing, and now you're saying you're going to leave. And I think that this is an indirect reference to the resurrection, to the death and the resurrection here. He doesn't exactly say it, but yet I think he's inferring or implying. Which one is it? He's implying. Yeah, he's implying.
You're inferring his implication. Or
Right.
implying.
Sometimes I make that mistake, but he's implying that that this is what Peter was missing that whole opportunity. So the successor looks at the testimony of the contemporary. This is his words, and he hopes that it's not too long and voluminous, I guess is the word. And that reminded me when I used to go in the bookstore looking for books. I go in the religious section, and then I'd see a stack of books on systematic theology. And I'm thinking, who would sit down and read all these books on somebody's ideas on what God is all about? And I don't know if he was referring to that, but he's saying the successor, most people don't want to sit down and read that kind of stuff. We want a short book. Give us the Reader's Digest version of the gospel here. What's it all about? Don't go on and on and on and on like I do sometimes. And it also reminded me of John 21:25. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but John is saying right at the end, I think this is even the last verse, it says, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, and which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. So he's speaking about, there's a lot of things Jesus did that just didn't get into the gospel.
Wow, that's crazy to think about. Like, think about what's on the editing room floor. Like, right? Like, I mean, are those details on the same status as the resurrection? Right.
But it just gives us.
Or are they just kind of like, oh yeah, one time Jesus made me a sandwich out of nothing.
Well, how many miracles did he do? How many people did he heal? And so forth. So we only got hit with the highlights here. So we don't know all the things that Jesus did. We can only imagine it. But this is evidence that he did do more. So we don't have the whole story. Even in the gospel, it doesn't tell us everything, believe it or not. Then he continues on. We can't do away with everything historical. Then everything would become Socratic and equality would seem to have been achieved. And that kind of puzzled me for a while too. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm not sure what he means about that. But I think what he's getting at here is that we would, if we did away with everything that is historical, we'd lose the importance of the teacher again. Mm-hmm. The uniqueness of the teacher, which would bring us back to the Socratic, where the teacher doesn't matter, right? Because history doesn't matter. This would bring us back to that idea that the teacher doesn't even have to exist. Only the teaching has to exist. Go ahead.
And just to talk about like what we were talking about earlier, how Kierkegaard thought that the Socratic would be introduced if people could pass on the condition through successive generations. Think about how that devalues. If everybody could become a god, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah,
then that being a god really isn't that big of a deal.
Yeah, what would divinity mean for us if everybody was a god? Well, I'm a god too. Are you a god? Yeah, I'm a god.
Cool.
You're absolutely. I didn't even think of that. That's a good comment. So he continues on. He says, could it be true that God would set aside a few special people and set them up as different? Wouldn't that be unjust? So he kind of asks us a question to think about. Is time really important? Does God pick certain people out? As he says, would he permit an accident of time to decide who would be granted his favor? So does God show favoritism? And we have to kind of think about that. We might think that he does. Did he show favoritism to the disciples? Well, maybe before we did our discussion here, we might have said yes. But now that we know the contemporaries don't have any advantage over the non-contemporaries, the answer has to be no, or should be no, if we were convincing. Or would he make it equally difficult for all? And I like the way that I think he put it that way, not as though it's easy, but as though it's difficult. So we're all facing the difficulty of belief rather than the ease of belief. So I think that turns the phrase upside down, doesn't it? When we think about the gospel.
Oh yeah. I mean, it comports, I think, with what we said last week about what Kierkegaard saw as his true mission in life. He knew he couldn't make things easier. He could just make things more difficult and to dramatize that difficulty for everyone.
Right. And he sure lived up to that. And then he's got a quote here that I'm going to quote here. It says, is it conceivable that the God would permit an accident of time to decide to whom he would grant his favor? Or is it not rather worthy of the God to make his covenant with men equally difficult for every human being in every time and place? Equally difficult, since no man is able to give himself the condition, nor yet is to receive it from another. So it's kind of a summation, I think, here of his point of view, that this is equally difficult. Why? Because we can't earn it. It kind of even goes back to Luther a little bit, that we can't earn the condition. We can't do it through history. We can't do it through time. We can't do it through good deeds. We can't do it through intelligence. We can't earn the right to this condition. It comes from God through faith. That's the only way that it can be had. And then he gives us a conclusion, a little portion here. He recognizes that the contemporary generation has to feel some of the pain by the coming into the being of the paradox. Each generation must suffer through this pain. And he doesn't tell us what the pain is, but we could discuss this a little bit. We have intellectual pain that I think we suffer, giving up our intellectual striving for superiority, perhaps. Our emotional pain, and sometimes physical pain as martyrdom. How would you view the pain portion of his comment here, if you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intellectual thing I could probably speak to
Sure,
a
go
great
ahead.
deal. I mean, only just from my personal experience, right? I mean, obviously, as someone who's like founding a teaching company who's all about ideas, like I've gone many years puffed up with intellectual pride and thinking that a lot of these ideas were absolutely repugnant to the intellect. And yeah, it took a while to get over myself, and it's an incredible difficulty. I see it in other people who are resistant to the Christian ideas, that are more comfortable with the intellectual paradoxes, but may have deep emotional reasons that cause that rebellion, that will never allow them to do this. And it may be because of how Christianity has been portrayed in popular media. It may be because of hypocrites. It may be because of abandonment or something like that. That there are just other emotional issues that'll be very difficult to get over. And it's something we'll talk about with Sartre when we do our discussion of No Exit. If I can just sort of, one of my favorite parts so far is how Garcon in hell, he talks about how the psychology, the pain of psychology or pain of the mind is so much more onerous than red hot pokers and being flayed alive and stuff like that. He actually, towards the end of No Exit, wishes for physical pain rather than the emotional and the intellectual pain. I think that's really interesting, that in a way, martyrdom and physical pain, and maybe that's just a fanciful way of saying it, would be, I don't think any of us would ever want to be crucified or be eaten by lions or something like that, but it may be preferable to the intellectual and emotional pain that goes along with trying to accept the paradox. It actually might not be that bad by comparison.
Yeah, no, it's a thought. I was also thinking about the family, how many families, if they're raised in a certain particular denomination, if we could say that, or a certain religion, when a person is confronted with the paradox and then has faith in, let us just say, Christ here as the teacher, they get ostracized from the family. It costs them their entire family. It happens every day. It costs, it splits the family. It divides the family. You can't go off on your own. You can't change denominations, because if you do, we don't want to have anything to do with you. So there's that kind of emotion as well that it costs us. And that's both emotional and physical too. I guess we might see it that way, as it divides the family.
Where do you think Johann Climacus is, this fictional character that Kierkegaard has made? It seems that Johann Climacus is very comfortable with the intellectual paradoxes of Christianity. He doesn't seem to be a Luke. He doesn't seem to be that to be puffed up on intellectual pride. My inference would be is that Johann Climacus might be closer to someone who might be irrationally emotionally resistant to Christianity, because he's deeply sympathetic to it on an ideological level.
Yeah,
what do you think?
When we first started, I might disagree with you when we first started, because I saw him, because he went down the Socratic path and he made these comparisons. I kind of thought of him in the intellectual, philosophical realm. As the discussion developed, though, I think I can see the change, that he's revealing a little bit more about himself, the emotional side of himself, and so forth. And based upon this work, Luke, and you can probably set me straight on this, many commentators say that Climacus was certainly not a Christian, certainly not a believer. But I don't see the negativity in this work. Now, maybe there was another work that Climacus did where he denies it. But I don't really see, I don't know how somebody could know so much about this situation, about the teacher, be able to talk about it with such emotion and with such clarity and understanding, to say that he really didn't believe. So I'm not convinced by this work alone, as it stands here, that Climacus hadn't already taken that step. But can you set me clear on that?
Well, and I think that's a wonderful point. And I think really the only way to resolve it, Bob, is that we have to look at the unpublished or posthumously published Johann Climacus, and we have to look at Kierkegaard's my point of view as an author. Because I
guess so.
Yeah, I think it would become, based off this alone, it's I think that's a right perspective to take. But I mean, if I didn't know that sentiment was floating out there in scholarly communities, that Johann Climacus is, he's definitely not a Christian. Like, would I just assume that? I'm not sure. If this is all I had to deal with, I don't know if I would make that assumption. So I guess we'll have to go deeper.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So we'll both go down that path together then. We'll keep an open, at least we both have an open mind towards it. I'm willing to listen to any other information. So now he gives a critical analysis here. He criticizes his generation now, and we know who he's criticizing, I guess, but he criticizes his generation who are already celebrating victory. Perhaps this is evidence that they do not have the condition. Maybe they don't really understand, like we were talking about, certain denominations, they kind of mask the condition but with artificial things. So people get the sense that they really are a believer, but they haven't ever confronted the condition or the paradox. They don't even know what it is, but they think they're a believer because they're involved in the church political, we might call it. Now, he may mean their triumph, that they have a sense that they've triumphed over sin, or understanding as though they had already made it into heaven. Like the once saved, always saved. Well, yeah, I made a conviction when I was a teenager, so that's going to get me all the way through, and I never have to worry about it again. I can do whatever I want. Doesn't matter. I'm on the train. I'm going to heaven, right? They see God as an omnipotent wonder worker. and he who humbled himself to become equal to us. So they see that side of God and that side of the teacher, but they're locked into that, and they don't really see how that affects themselves. I'm confronted with a lot of times people telling me how much God loves us, and so caught up in the love of God that they forget that that's supposed to somehow relate to who they are. It's not acceptance of God to everything and every practice and that they might do. It's not like we have an all-loving God who isn't righteous. There's no such thing as righteous. He just accepts everything we do because he loves us. So I think I would say that's kind of a victory celebration before it's time. We need to see the paradox here, not just a loving God. We need to see, what does that mean? He loves us. What's my response to a loving God? And he says it's so he also criticizes those who promise the believer a system. And so I think we all know that's a code word for Hegel and others, as well as today there's a lot of systematic theology offered by cults. They've through the ages they've realized that this is a distraction, but this is a way to get believers. We present you with an alternative to the paradox. Don't worry about the paradox and being confronted by God. We've got something easier. We'll do all that for you. You know, all you have to do is say some words, or wear certain clothing, or give up certain things, or read certain books, and you can become one of us. And you'll become, like Kierkegaard would say, lost in the crowd. Through the years, they've realized this is a very successful practice, offered to do it for people. And you'll be a very successful cult leader, because that's really what's behind lots of cults and lots of religions as well.
That's interesting. I never really thought about that before. It's like, let us do all the hard work for your salvation.
Yeah.
And you just sit there and we'll make this exchange, you know.
And make the checks out to the very reverend such and such.
Yeah.
Cool, right?
Yeah.
Then he says, it is well known that Christianity is the only historical phenomenon. All right. So there are other religions out there, but do they really wrestle with history? Do they really have a paradox? Do they really have a historical phenomenon? Taoism doesn't. Taoism doesn't matter who teaches it. You know, it's all Socratic. It's the teaching. Buddhism is really the same way. Buddha, don't even know if he existed or not, and how many Buddhas were there. But it was not really important. Buddha didn't really do anything. He isn't the paradox. He had teachings which we follow. Hinduism is the same way. And actually Islam is the same way. Muhammad was not.
You know, some people might make quibble with that about Hinduism. I'm no expert on Hinduism, but like, I mean, there's all sorts of mythology bound up.
Yeah, but which one individual would rise to the top?
I don't know. Maybe Arjuna? I don't know. See, I don't know enough about Hinduism to say.
But again, these things, these historical things, get kind of lost in the myth and the mythological end, because it's just a story being retold. Whether it really happened or not isn't really the issue. It's just a story. But for us, well, it says they may contain important men, but they're still considered to be prophets and not God incarnate. So even though in Hinduism they have many gods incarnated, but we have the only one that has one God incarnated.
And I think, yeah, and I buy this. You know, you could say, I mean, I guess Muhammad is a prophet in Islam, and you could say the same thing about Judaism, that, you know, Moses and others were prophets and not the God incarnate. What about this line of argument? Again, I think you're particularly good at addressing these things because you did look at world religions for so long. Some people will say that Christianity evolved out of more primitive religions, such as Zoroastrianism, or that there were like some pagan faiths where there was a God man talked about. I think Nietzsche talks about this a little bit somewhere. I can't remember where, maybe in Thus Speaks Zarathustra or whatever. And that really the Christian ideal evolved, has had a context, and that this idea was sort of being kicked around. And if you start digging, you'll start to find that there was this religion somewhere where the God came into incarnation and the community recorded that he died. What would you make about, what would you say about that criticism?
Well, I've read the criticisms, and I actually read the stories that they say are similar. And there is really not a lot of similarity when you actually read it. When you hear people explaining it and trying to make a point out of it, they make it sound a whole lot more, what would I say, synonymous with the story of Christ, with the Gospels. But when you actually take it down and put it to the test and read it, you say, wait a second, this isn't saying what they said it said. There's a couple of things in here that might intersect with the stories, but they're certainly not parallel, and there's certainly no evolution going on here. But it's easy to make that idea of evolution up, but there's intersection that takes place. And why? Well, because I think that all of us have a perception of God. We have ideas of God, and if we all sat down and read our ideas, wrote our ideas of God, don't you think there'd be intersections? Don't you think that people would say, God forgives me for my sins, and somebody else on the other side of the earth would write, oh yes, God forgives me for my sins, and then I can say, oh, you see that one evolved from the other. Of course
not. Totally. I think the question becomes, and I think Kierkegaard says this in other places, could the human mind have ever dreamt up something like the passion events, going back to the resurrection? Could the human mind have ever dreamt up the idea that God would die on a cross? And Nietzsche thinks that it could. Nietzsche thinks that Nietzsche creates this whole conspiratorial theory about how the oppressed Jewish population came up with this narrative as a way to ultimately defeat the Romans in the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. But I think Kierkegaard elsewhere has said, no, this idea is so radical, the idea of a God dying on a cross, that in a way it almost testifies to its authenticity, because it couldn't spring from our collective unconscious.
Right. I agree with that. And I also answered those critics, and I'd say, read Genesis. Read the story of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, king of Salem. This is before Judaism, kind of. This is Abraham is confronted by a high priest from Salem, from which would become Jerusalem. And Abraham recognizes in this priest what was it called? He was the priest of the Most High God. And Abraham recognizes in him a familiarity with this priest. And he offers to tithe to this priest, to give him 10%. He validates Melchizedek as a priest. And even Paul later on validates him as being a type of Christ, because he comes in, he has no family, no beginning, no end. He just appears there on sight. And so the idea of Melchizedek, again, it's pre-Jewish. But what does that actually teach us? It teaches us that God was communicating with man all over the world.
Good gracious, Bob, I've never heard this story ever.
Oh, no?
That's incredible. Let me get this straight. In Genesis,
yes,
there is a prefiguration of Christ for Abraham.
Well, there are more than one, but yes, Melchizedek was one that Paul writes about, talking about that Melchizedek was a type, because Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem. Christ is the king of Jerusalem. Melchizedek appears on the scene, no mention of his genealogy, which for Christ being divine has no genealogy. So Paul makes this typical connection between the two. And being a priest of the Most High God. Christ was a priest of the Most High God. The high priest, he was called, our high priest. So there's lots of similarities between Melchizedek and Christ. And the funny part is Melchizedek was not taught by Abraham. Melchizedek came from a whole different world, a whole different era of I'm trying to think of the people that were there. I can't think of it. But anyway, he comes from a whole different group of people. And yet Abraham recognizes him as the high priest, a true high priest of the Most High God. Elyon in Hebrew was the high priest. So it is a very interesting story.
Can I say something crazy?
Sure.
Do you ever sometimes think that, like, you know, the world used to be like really magical and like really crazy, and then it only really recently became very rational and scientific? Has that thought ever crossed your mind that like stuff used to be like really cool and magical and out of this world, and then like all of a sudden it became boring?
Yeah, I think when we were children, I think just for me as an individual, when I was a young child, I was much more involved in the mystical side, the magical side, you know. I don't know if I got it all out of me, but I wish I could go back to that era again. Don't you?
I don't know. Maybe there really were giants running around or something. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, there's still I think there's a mystical side. I think what was more imagination has turned mystical. I'll put it to you that way. I still think there's that side in me, but I think it's more mystical than it is make-believe.
Yeah. I'm just joking around. All right. So
no, that's true. Okay, so we're getting near the end here, and this is a quote here we could probably talk about because it's very similar. Maybe this is even the quote you were talking about. He says, "No system of philosophy addressing itself only to thought, no mythology addressing itself solely to the imagination, no historical knowledge addressing itself to the memory has ever had this idea, of which it may be said with all possible ambiguity in this connection, that it did not arise in the heart of any man." Is this the verse, or is there another verse?
I think that's the passage that I had in mind.
Yeah, because he's saying the same thing, that this isn't something that we could come up with from the heart of any man. This is something so beyond. It's not something you would come up with. Like if you were going to come up with a story, you could do better than this. You could make it a lot easier to believe in it. If you wanted to control people, you wouldn't come up with something that individualizes them. You would come up with a cult that forces people to follow a leader. Paul never did that. You know, when Paul went around, that was the last thing he wanted. He even said that. I don't want people saying, I'm from Paul, I'm from Peter, I'm from this person, I'm from that person. He said, we're all from Christ. So if Paul was spreading around some kind of a religious cult, the first thing he would say is, you can't get there without me. You need me. Mm-hmm. You know, but he didn't. And then the last quote I have here is, since we have here assumed a new, and this is from the section, I left my book somewhere. This is from the last section that he had, the moral, that's what it is, called the moral. Since we have here assumed a new organ, faith, and a new presupposition, the consciousness of sin, and a new decision, the moment, and a new teacher, the God in time. So this is his moral, that he's given us a new organ, a new presupposition, and a new decision, and a new teacher. So he kind of wraps it all up in this last sentence of what hopefully he has done for us. So did he do it for you, Luke?
You know, yeah. I mean, ever since I started studying Kierkegaard, people have always asked me, what should I read? And I've I say that if you really want to understand what Kierkegaard's getting at, you go to the philosophical fragments. But it's too difficult really for just someone to casually pick up. And I guess what I hope we have done here through our discussion series and seminar is that we've given people no excuse to not have something that they can just plug in and go with. I think we've done a big service to them here. I mean,
but you would say they still need to try to tackle it on their own. Is that right? I
Oh,
mean,
yeah,
this is
yeah,
not
yeah.
a substitution for reading it.
No. But we can, hopefully we can entice them to do that through this. But yeah, I'm just really proud of us getting through this whole thing. I mean, I know it took us 13 hours to do it or something like that.
Yeah.
But we did it. We're done. We're done. I think I understand it with a greater sense of detail than I ever did before. But at the same time, it just kind of reaffirms what I thought, that this is kind of the skeleton key to everything else. I don't know. I've been too busy to really have too many reflections on it. I mean, do you have any reflections about it, what you thought at the beginning? Because I think, was this the first time you read it? Or had you read it?
No, this is the second time I've read it. But I didn't remember a lot of it. I think the only reason I know I read it is because I saw my highlights and my notes in there. But I didn't really remember a whole lot, because I certainly didn't read it as we're reading it with discussing it. That helps me to remember stuff. Reading it, highlighting it, even sometimes taking notes doesn't always make me remember so well. I have a hard time remembering. But doing this is really reinforcing the message that Kierkegaard makes through Climacus.
Do you feel changed through this the process of teaching this text? I mean, I think the thing is, if I could, this is the second one that we've completed together. We did the 18 Upbuilding Discourses, and with that one, I don't know. I felt more, there was sort of aesthetic dizzying, like the aesthetic aspects of religion, and I kind of felt like there's a more spiritual dimension to it, and I felt elevated in this respect. I don't know if I have enough distance to even really comment on how this particular text has changed me or not changed me. Do you have any thoughts on your transformation?
Well, I think it's certainly deepened my understanding of the gospel, of what Christ was all about and what God is all about, and his interaction with me as an individual. But it also helped me to understand how to talk about it and discuss it with other people. To see it in the realm of paradoxical, and in the realm of having a what did he call it again? A condition, helps me to present it to other people with that in mind. Not that I have to present it as a paradox, but it helps me to understand what is standing in this person's way of faith. How can I help them get closer to the condition without me becoming, the second hand, trying to hand it off to somebody where I play that role. So how do I get out of the way and give them that, help them towards the condition? So it's helped me to see that.
I'd have to say, because I think it reaffirmed, for me, I think it reaffirmed not only how rigorous a philosopher Kierkegaard is. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that when he writes so much in the vein of literature. I also think one of the greatest things about doing what we did here was just, I think this particular text allowed for so much of your seminary training to come out. I felt like I'm not trying to be too obsequious here. I learned a lot from Kierkegaard, and I saw things in a new light or studied them in greater detail than I ever had before. But I think I may have actually learned a little bit more from you in general.
Oh, well, man.
I think that was the biggest takeaway for me, is that this reaffirmed a lot of what I already knew, but you brought so much to the table in this seminar. I kind of feel like I was studying your brain as much as I was studying Kierkegaard's.
Well, this is in color, so everybody can see how beet red I am from not knowing what to say to that. But I really do appreciate that. But what I'm glad about is that God is able to use me. You know, I don't take it as an ego thing at all, really. I just am so glad that you've given me the opportunity to present what I know, because what good does it do inside my own head? It just bounces around in there. You know, being able to share it with other people gives me a sense that I have a purpose. So, you know, it's the compliment gets reflected back to you again, my friend.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was sort of one of those individuals who wanted to study everything, but you can't. You only have a certain number of years. And I really wanted to go to seminary. And I feel, in addition to, you know, you kind of being a little bit of a spiritual advisor, you definitely are giving me a seminary education face to face. I feel very, very, very lucky to have it.
Well, I'm lucky to have you for a friend.
Cool. All right. Well, I hope everybody's enjoyed this ride with us. And, you know, Bob and I are just going to keep making stuff. We've got some more stuff planned for you. Most Thursday, we'll have a new seminar out on Sartre's No Exit. I've mentioned throughout this. We've got more Baudelaire poems. We've got more Kierkegaard. It's never ending. So download the Noetic app, and we'll just feel free to give us some feedback on YouTube or SoundCloud or wherever else about maybe some things that you would like to see, or if you feel like you want to weigh in on any of these issues. This is a very democratic thing that we're doing here, bringing in people from different walks of life. So maybe there's a role for you. But saying that, I'll just bring this to a close, and I've got to run to my Jane Eyre seminar, Bob, so I won't be able to hang out too much after this. But thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.